So finally, here we are. Let's take a look at our last video. Don't be disappointed, don't be sad, but we're going to wrap up and use everything we've learned in genetics so far to look at this example of what we call these family trees in genetics. And let's focus primarily on humans here, but things are about to get pretty interesting. So knowing everything that we know about genetics, we can actually, in a very, very scientific manner, can study how traits are passed down and inherited in humans, one trait at a time. And in fact, what we're going to see through these what are called pedigree charts, or just simply pedigrees, which sort of looks like an upside down family tree here, we actually can determine if a trait sometimes, if we're lucky, is dominant or recessive, and what people's genotypes actually are. Do they have two big B's? Do they have a big B and a little b, etc.? This is a very, very powerful and useful tool. So over here you can see I gave a little key at the bottom, and the first thing we'll notice is that shapes are very, very important here. For example, we can see circles and squares. We can see that some people are shaded in while others are not. What is going on here? We even have little lines slashed through for people that are deceased. Apparently there's some kind of code here that we need to know. So let's look at some basic symbols before we go on and try to solve and analyze some of these things. So some basic guidelines here. In a pedigree, it's accepted that anytime you're representing a female, they will utilize circles. Maybe females are well-rounded and males, conversely, are squares. We'll leave that one alone. But you have to use those shapes. That is a universally accepted format for any genetic analysis. The other things that we had noticed is that any person in these pedigrees, these family trees of genetics that are shaded in, express the trait. It doesn't mean that they are carriers or that they might have a gene for it. It means they actually express it and they actually show it. Conversely, anyone that is not shaded in means they do not express it. Now we've got to be careful here. Think back to, let's say, a recessive trait. Isn't it possible for someone to show a quote-unquote normal dominant allele, or excuse me, a normal dominant phenotype, but still carry and have one of their genes be recessive? That person would not be shaded in, but we could call them carriers in this case, and we'll see that in just a moment. So if we take all of your knowledge that you have, which you know quite a bit now about genetics, a few of the things we can actually do with these pedigrees. We can predict the outcomes or likeliness of certain events happening, which, you know, using regular standard Punnett squares like we've been doing, we could say things like, oh, there's a 50% chance of your child having it, or a 100% chance, etc. So that's pretty useful. We can also figure out if that trait, or in some cases a disease or a disorder, is inherited in a dominant or a recessive fashion. Like, is that trait dominant or is that recessive? And we can even actually, if we're smart enough, we can go back in the past through some of the previous generations to explain why an event has occurred. Like, for example, husband and wife have a child who's born with some disease, and the husband and wife are normal. What happened? Whose fault is it? Is it the husband's? Is it the wives'? Is it either person, neither person? What's going on there? So we'll be able to do all those things. So if we take the information we have and all of our information and skills from genetics, how are we going to determine if a trait is dominant or recessive? Let's try and look at one and let's see. Let's look at the rules in action, if you will. Now we've got two examples here. A trait for widow's peak, as we can see right here. She comes down in this weird Count Chocula hairline. I'd be embarrassed if I had that. Her sister, in this case, does not have a widow's peak. And for this trait over here, we're looking at the same family of these grumpy-looking ladies. Earlobes, whether their earlobes are attached or they're free and dangling. Two different traits you can see for the same family. Now, if we look at them, we can see here some people are shaded in, some are not, as we can see over here also. But that this trait for widow's peak, someone has already gone through and done the work for us. They've written in genotypes, and they've determined that this trait for widow's peak is dominant. And in this case, what we've actually seen is that the trait that we're studying here, attached or free earlobes in this case, is recessive. Now the question is, how did they determine that? Kind of confusing. Well, let's take a closer look and let's see. So we don't want to confuse ourselves. Let's try one together and let's look at this one. Now I've taken some liberties here to show you that this trait is indeed autosomal dominant, but how would we go about figuring that out? Let's say that I hadn't told you that it was autosomal dominant and we didn't know that. What would we do? Well, we can make an assumption here. We can try and guess, and let's pretend. Let's pretend it's a recessive trait, whatever this trait is we're studying. That would mean that if it's recessive, anyone that shows it, like this guy right here, that guy right there, would have to have two, we'll use F's in this case, I don't know why, I'm just using little f's. Anyone that had little f's, or excuse me, that's shaded in, would indeed have little f's. Okay, that's great, that works out awesome, but look at this case over here on this side. If each of these parents have little f's, all they can give to their children are indeed little f's. That would mean this boy has a little f, the second born daughter has a little f, but what about this guy? He could only get little f's from his parents, correct? Mom can only give a little f, dad can only give a little f. That would mean he would have to be shaded in too, and he's not. So therefore, it doesn't work out in a recessive manner. That blows up. We know it's not recessive now. We can assume that it must be dominant. Everyone catch that? Go ahead, pause it, rewind, do what you have to do to go back and look at that. I'm assuming you've done so. Now let's go and look at must be dominant here. So that, what does that mean? Every single person that's shaded in has to have at least one big F. So let's go ahead and take care of that. Everyone there has big F's, and conversely, anyone that's not shaded in, we know they cannot have a big F. They cannot have a dominant allele. Otherwise, they would show it. So let's go ahead and fill in all their little F's. Easy, easy, easy parcheesi. I know, I'm a nerd. But we're still not fully done yet because, for example, what about this guy right here? How do we know if number 9 is a big F homozygous or big F little f? Can you tell? Look at his parents. He had to have gotten that big F from dad, but what could he have gotten from mom? Only a little f. So we know he's heterozygous. Let's do the same thing over here. We know these two individuals here and here have big F's. But look at this guy, this third-born son. How did he get two little f's to show the recessive trait? Where did he get them from? Well, mom and dad, of course. So let's fill them in. Now we know they're heterozygous. The only problem is, do we know for sure what that daughter and that son are? Do we know if they're homozygous or heterozygous? If we did out a Punnett square, we could see that, well, both options would come up. We're not sure. So in this case, we would just leave it. We don't know for sure until they get married and have children of their own. Pretty useful trick. Just by filling in the squares for this family, we've determined that this trait, whatever it is absolutely dominant. Pretty cool. Now that certainly makes them seem rather easy. But just beware that for this fake family we have here, there can be real-life cases. Holy cowabunga. This is from the royal family. We can see some very royal-sounding names here for a trait of hemophilia. This one's huge. I promise I'll never ask you to analyze one this big. I promise. But two really, really useful rules for us in determining them. If we ever see a pedigree in which you see the following. If you ever see neither parent expressing the trait but a child does, that means it must be recessive. Now if we think about that, what that's saying here is there's dad, there's mom, neither one has it, but in this case, let's say they have a daughter who does, it must be a recessive trait. She had to have 2 recessive alleles that were in fact hidden in mom and dad. Mom and dad were carriers. They did not show it, but they passed it on to their daughter. Pretty nice trick there. Our other trick that's very useful, that if we ever see it, is down here at the bottom for number 2. And it's kind of the opposite. If you ever see a case where both mom and dad have it, they express this trait, whatever it may be, and they have a child who doesn't show it, then it must be dominant. And the reasoning is the same. Let's say that dad has a dominant allele but carrying a recessive. Mom has a dominant allele but carrying a recessive. And if they both pass on recessives now, their kid doesn't show it. But mom and dad do. These are 2 very, very useful tricks that once you've had practice with pedigrees, you can spot them. It gives you the answer right away. Again, awesome, awesome, awesome stuff. Very, very powerful. So, a couple of other little strange symbols you may see, and then we'll try one together to end with. Notice males and females will always be circles and squares. We draw lines to show matings here. We don't care about marriage in biology, unfortunately. We only care about sexual reproduction, sharing of genes. As we've seen how the families shake out with multiple generations. This line would be generation 1. This would be the next generation. A unique way to show twins. There are some options there. Remember, our shaded, affected individuals, they express it. A really useful one here, only true for recessive traits. If they're carriers, sometimes you'll see them halfway shaded in. Means they don't express it, but they have 1 recessive allele. We can see for sex-linked traits, which we've already talked about, deaths, abortions, and all sorts of other interesting symbols. And this unique one down here, we'll ignore that guy. So let's try this one together. I'll pull this up on the screen, and you can take time to pause it, but I want you to give this a shot. I want you to figure out if this is dominant or recessive, and try to figure out the genotypes of each person, and then we'll even play what if here. So I'm going to pause it. Well, you pause it now, and give this one a shot. We'll wait, and let's look at and see how you did. All right, well, how'd you make out? How do we know if it's dominant or recessive? It doesn't say here. Well, let's go through and look for our rules. Do we see a case where both parents in either generation 1, generation 2, or generation 3, where both parents have it and none of their kids do? I don't see that. But if we look right here, here's one of our rules. Neither parent has the trait. Expresses the trait, rather, but they have kids who do. What does that tell us? It tells us it must be a recessive trait. It's hidden in the parents. That means they were carriers, which notice is not shown here, but we know that. Both of their sons here had 2 little f's. That means that this daughter has at least a big F for now. We're not sure. And we can then go back and fill in our squares and know who has what. Anybody that's shaded in has to have 2 recessives, and we can then go and notice that anyone that's not shaded in has at least a big F. That's standard for us. And we've got some other assumptions that we have to make here. If we start over here in this side, dad can only give, in this case right here, a recessive allele. That means that both of these children have 2 little f's. That also means that for this parent, for this young man to have 2 little f's, had to have a little f as well. Same thing holds true right here. This kid has 2 little f's, had to come from both mom and dad. This daughter we don't know. This one we don't know either. Oh, wait. Do we know for this one? Had to get a little f from dad. Boom. So as you can see, we can, notice a son here, had to get 2 little f's from these parents. We've played detective and we've determined quite a bit. Sorry about the little cutoff there. So now you're free to move on and give it us a shot and try it with some practice pedigree problems and see if we're able to predict the future. Good luck.